Welcome to another very special edition of Old School Scribe Podcast. Very happy to have the great Ron Borges with us, longtime football and boxing writer. He's one of my, he's a guy I grew up reading, so I'll give
What a
you a
thing.
sense of how old he is. But
What
he
a
looks better
scary
than me.
thought,
But he looks
isn't it?
young. But he looks younger than me, though. Ron, tell us a little bit about the photos you've got up on your wall. Let's start there.
Sure. Okay, Butchie, we're in my little miniature office here at home, and you won't be able to, your viewers won't totally make it up, but right above my right shoulder there is a very rare piece of memorabilia. It's a signed photo from Muhammad Ali, who I was blessed to become friendly with over the years. It's a picture of him slapping Sonny Liston around in the first fight, but what makes it rare is that he wrote a note, which he seldom did, and the note says, serve God, he is the one, Muhammad Ali.
Is that 1964? Did he sign that in 64?
No, he signed it. He was already in the midst of Parkinson's, so his hand's a little shaky, but so it was fairly late. But so I'm blessed to have that. And next to it, you can't really make it out, but it's a picture of a name familiar to you and all New England fight fans. The great Tony DeMarco, former welterweight champion, after being knocked cold by Carmen Basilio. And it's a classic picture of the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. It was a great picture taken by Hy Askin, who was a really well-known sports photographer from Sports Illustrated for many years. And the photo is, in the foreground is Tony knocked out cold as his manager, his trainer rather, is pulling the mouthpiece out of his mouth so he doesn't choke to death. And in the background, with the lights from the arena shining on him, is Carmen Basilio having leapt into the air of hands of his trainer with one arm thrust up. So there's the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat all together. And lastly, we have one other one. There's a little painting there of a beach scene from a friend of mine. And then above it, however, is a picture of the great Rocky Marciano knocking out Archie Moore. Archie's sort of down on one knee and sort of falling through the ropes. But what makes it great is the referee's about halfway across the ring, and he's coming forward with his arms spread and this look of horror on his face. And you could see the crowd, most of them in ties and jackets, which you would never see in a sporting event today, but leaping up in astonishment as Archie is tumbled to the turf.
I actually got a quote from Carmen Basilio in the ring at the old War Memorial in Syracuse.
Oh, wow.
I happened to cover Rocky Frado's last fight, and
really?
You would probably remember Rocky Frado. I think he was a very good middleweight. I think,
yeah,
if I'm not mistaken. But I got him about 3 years after he had retired. He came back, and he ran into a left-handed truck driver from Georgia named Harry Daniels, who told him during the fight, "Why don't you go back and work for your daddy?" Because I think his father owned a construction company in Geneva, New York. I think I'm piecing all this together because this is from 30 years ago. But Carmen was looking pretty disgusted, and he said, "Well, if he wants to keep fighting, tell him to get into shape." But
yeah, Basilio was a hard man. I was talking to him one day at HBO's offices, and Carmen must have been 75 at that point if he was a day, and still a hard guy, and talked with his hands a lot, So we're sitting there waiting for something, and we're talking, and every time he wants to emphasize a point, bang, he's hitting me with a left hand in the chest, kaboom, kaboom, And after about the fourth or fifth time, my chest didn't feel that good. I said, Carmen, what are you doing? I'm going to have to go to the doctor's office after that. I said, what are you talking about? Bam! Those heavy-handed guys, they're heavy-handed till the day they die.
How many Ali fights do you think you covered, Ron?
Oh, a lot. I came along fairly late in his career, but a lot. In fact, I was moved this past week when Leon Spinks died. I was at that fight when Leon upset him. My most vivid memory was the day before the fight, sitting with Leon and his manager, a guy named Sam Sullivan, at the old coffee shop at Caesar's Palace, which if anybody who's a veteran of Vegas will remember that was the hangout place to be. And we're sitting there talking day before the fight, and in walks Ali with Sugar Ray Robinson. And Leon was like a 12-year-old. he kept going, Sam, that's Ali with Ray Robinson. That's Ali with Ray Robinson. And I remember sitting there thinking, does this guy know he's going to fight Ali in 24 hours? And lo and behold, 24 hours later, he was the champion of the world for 7 months.
Right. Now, I first read you growing up in Framingham, Mass, in the Boston Globe of the 1970s and 80s, and you obviously covered both boxing and the NFL,
right,
for the paper. What did you like best? I mean, I guess they're both fun in their own right.
Oh, sure, no question. I mean, I always liked boxing best because I always felt the fight. First off, your access was always much better to the fighters than to anybody else, right, in sports, because they were on their own, and they knew they had to sell tickets. There was no, and they understood the connection between, publicity and selling tickets. But I also found them to be the most honest of fighters. Of athletes.
Yeah.
Partially, I think, because they're in there alone, but there's only a limited amount of excuses you can make. You can make it, you can blame your trainer if you want, but otherwise it's on you. So I always found them to be pretty honest. And I remember one time I asked Tony DeMarco, the fellow I mentioned a few minutes ago, he was probably in his late 70s at that point. Generally, fighters get in less trouble than other athletes in general. There's some spectacular ones who get in trouble every day, but they might have checkered backgrounds, but usually when they're fighting, they don't get in much trouble. So I said to Tony, why is it that fighters who are the most aggressive by the nature of their sport of all athletes seem to have less problems, outside the ring, unlike, a lot of team sport athletes? And he had an interesting response, which he said to me, well, we've had all the angry punched out of us. We're not angry about anything. And I think that was like, you hardly ever hear about a fighter being involved in any kind of fight, assault type thing. And I had another fighter named Joe Calzaghe, who was a longtime middleweight and super middleweight champion from England, and a terrific guy. And I was sitting with him one night in Vegas with some other friends of ours, and he wasn't fighting that week, but he was in town for a big fight that I forget who was involved. And he was there, and his girlfriend was there, and all that. And at one point, he got up to go someplace, and some half-drunk galoot tried to sweep in on his girl, So Joe comes walking back, and a couple of us said, hey, dude, you might want to get out of Joe's chair. Typical drunk. Oh, you think you'll get bad, man? And Joe just sort of looked at him and said, I'd advise you to get out of my chair. It would be a good idea. And ultimately, he got convinced to leave, but Joe never really got belligerent about it, So I said to him after he said, I said, Joe, you could have knocked that guy out with either hand at any time you wanted to do that, but you didn't even raise your voice. How come? And he said, I know I can knock him out. It doesn't matter what he knows. I thought was, pretty self-confident person,
Well, you covered some fights in football too. If I think the great Will McDonough, were you there when the great Will McDonough punched out?
I was not there for that, although I had my own encounter with Claiborne, which ended in similar fashion. Although I didn't get to actually pop him because the general manager, Patrick Sullivan, got wind of it from the equipment man, called upstairs, and he came in and grabbed Claiborne by the T-shirt before I unloaded on him, which I was just about to do because we were having a pretty bad moment there. But I was there for what I consider the greatest on-field fight in the history of football fights, which was the Patriots had upset the Raiders in the playoffs out there. It was the year they went to the Super Bowl in '85. And young Pat Sullivan, general manager, was on the field running his mouth, crowing away at Howie Long. And suddenly, out of nowhere came Matt Millen, who bashed him in the side of the head with his helmet. And Pat had a great picture of the moment the moment of the collision of that helmet, and his hair is out like Don King's, and it's reeled back like this. And Millen's got a hold of his shirt with one hand, which is half ripped off him, and he's clubbing him with his hat. And Matt and Howie both signed it for Pat, and Pat had it up on his wall. That was the greatest I ever saw. Although I saw one other one, and you know how from all your years, training camps back in the day would have these tremendous fights, because when I first started with the Raiders in 1975, they had 6 preseason games or exhibition games. Training camp started 4th of July, didn't end until Labor Day. They were going 2-a-days every days. The Raiders gave them Sunday mornings off to go to mass, which I found somewhat amusing. And then they would practice Sunday afternoons. So you can imagine halfway through training camp, they were pretty sick of each other. And it was I think the greatest, well, I know for me personally, it was the greatest football fight I ever saw between Gene Upshaw, the Hall of Fame guard, and middle linebacker Monty Johnson. And it started in the morning because during a live drill, Monty got hit from behind and came flying into Upshaw. Upshaw didn't like Monty very much and believed that Monty had tried to take his knee out, which he didn't, but he did hit him in a vulnerable spot. So the fight started then. Ultimately got broken up. They went to lunch, and in those days we all ate together. It was so much better at Butchie than it is now. We all ate together, and they started screaming at each other in the dining room. And I cue you where you stand. It was great, and they got separated. So when we got to the afternoon practice, my friend Art Shell said to me, "Make sure you get there early." So Upshaw comes out, and both he and Monty, they're dressed in battle gear. They had the old things on their forearms that were, half made out of cement and all that. Well, sure enough, it wasn't 2 minutes into the first live drill. They commenced beating on each other, and they grabbed each other by the face mask, Bushy, and both started headbutting each other. Boom, boom. Plastic is flying like all over the place. None of the coaches are going anywhere near this, or the players. And finally, they sort of wrestled down to the ground for like a hockey fight, and they ran out of gas, And so then the coaches went in and separated the two of them and threw them both out for the day. But man, there was bits of plastic all over the field like shrapnel. It was great.
It's so much different now. I mean, I remember, my first training camp covering the Bengals, and there's Paul Brown on the table next to me, eating off the same tray I'm eating off of, and I remember Jim McNally. That's the first time I talked to McNally, the old offensive line coach, and he's telling me about a guy he drafted. He goes, me, Jim McNally. I told that guy over there, Paul Brown, I told him to draft a drunk, and he was, you just don't have the access. Well, I do, I guess, because I'm with the team. So I've got 1970s access in the 21st century. I'm lucky, but it's just not the way it was, No,
well, imagine this one summer with the Raiders. I used to watch film with the assistant coaches. I learned so much about the game, and they were happy to show you so that you made less mistakes, writing nonsensical things about what you think you saw. And they would tell you, who had was going to play with a difficult injury, so you weren't ripping him the next day because he didn't get his hands up or something. You realize he couldn't raise his hands above his waist. You would never, of course, there was no Twitter or anything.
Right.
But they all knew you wouldn't share that information, but they were trying to help you. So one summer, I'm in Lou Herber's office. He was the offensive coordinator for the Raiders. We're watching film, and those real film in those days. So he's showing me some things. And now they're getting ready to go out for the afternoon practice. And he says, "You coming out, or you want to watch some more film? I can just leave you here." I said, "Yeah, I want to watch some film for a while, and then I'll go out." He said, "Just make sure you rewind it when you're done." I said, "Yeah, okay." So, and he showed me how to do it. So I watched for a while, and then I was going to go out to watch the second half of practice. So I start to rewind the film, and I'm gathering up my stuff, and it's rewinding, And what I didn't realize was, typical Raiders, because they were cheap, there was more actual film on the reel than the reel was designed to hold. So when you got near the end, you had to slow it down, but he didn't tell me that. All of a sudden I hear this, and I look, and there's film all over the floor. I mean, it's everywhere off the spool, and the spool's spinning around like I'm going, oh my God. And I'm trying to figure out how to do, but I have no clue how to get it back on there. So ultimately I just leave his office with film all over the place. So the practice is over, walking off the practice. Imagine this, we're walking off the practice field together. I say, Lou, sir, how'd you do on that film? I said, oh, it was pretty good. He said, but we got a little problem. He goes, what's that? I said, well, some of the film kind of fell off. He said, oh, sometimes that happens. So we get back to his office, and there's film everywhere. It's like Otto Premich's room. He's looking like, what? I leave you alone for 5 minutes, and look what happened. They had to have the film guy come in and put it all back together. But that, would that ever happen today, Butchie? I'd get arrested by security. He'd get fired. I mean, it would never happen.
No, that's right. I mean, it's they would tell you stuff to help them, and obviously to help you. So it was also, and you were covering the league before the big money, before email, before Twitter. If they were going to make a case to get more money, the players, they had to go to the press.
Sure.
I mean, they made their statement through the media. Now they just don't. Now they don't use the media. They are the media with with their Twitter accounts.
Sure. No, that's right. And I think it's really a sad circumstance, because I think that it was much more humane in those days back. First, if there was less people covering, you didn't have every guy who owned a microphone stand there sticking his microphone in. But I thought they knew you and you knew them much better. We knew each other as people, and in many cases, they weren't making a lot more money than I was making with some of the younger guys. Now, the lowliest guy on the roster, I don't even remember anymore what the minimum salary is, but it's whatever it is, $300,000 or something like that. And there's no relating to a newspaper guy at that point. And I think that what's come with the money, and Al Davis predicted this, what's come with the money is this sort of growing gap between us and them, because there's too much to lose. I mean, in those days when I started out, there were guys who were still working second jobs in the winter or in the spring and summer, rather, because they needed the money. I mean, today these guys realize there's no other job most of them could get that would pay them a tenth of what they're making, so they're not going to put it at risk. It's too bad in a lot of ways.
Now,
and
this is not. Now,
I'll tell you a little story, Butchie, about how different it is. I was talking to Devin McCourty one day, well, he was talking to me actually, and good guy, and I've got relatively friendly with him over the years.
The Patriots defensive back.
Right. And it's, nowhere near as friendly. I mean, I used to play tennis with Cliff Branch. I'm not playing tennis with Devin McCourty, but by the way, Cliff was not that good a tennis player, but you couldn't get a ball by him because zoom, he was like jets. But anyway, McCourty comes up to me one day in the locker room and says, hey, can I ask you a question? And I said, yeah, sure. I ask you questions all the time. So yeah, what? He goes, that report card you do every week? I said, yeah. I do one of those. I, for a long time, did that report card, which was pretty well read. And I tried to do a good job with it, watch film and everything. And he goes, yeah. He said, well, some of us were talking, some of those grades you give them pretty tough. And I said, well, I give you what I think you deserve, He goes, yeah, but you don't really care what we think, do you? I said, well, let me think about that for a second, but can I ask you a question first? He goes, yeah, sure. I said, how many kids do I have? He goes, what? I said, how many kids do I have? He said, I don't know. I said, am I married, divorced, my wife alive, dead? I don't know. I said, well, that's why I don't care what you think. You've been here 5 or 6 years. You don't know a thing about me and never made any effort.
Yeah.
So we don't have anything real.
Yeah.
So, and he, to his credit, he said, I never thought about that, but man, you're right.
Yeah. And we're not saying, and we're not two old guys saying, get off our lawn. We're just two old guys saying, that's what the lawn used to look like. That's all.
Right.
There's nothing,
and
wrong,
it was
there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. And it was a smaller lawn, but it was a better lawn, I mean, and, you knew guys' problems to a greater extent than you do now. You weren't, you weren't running around and, anonymous source of this and anonymous source of that, and it turns out to be the guy's Aunt Louise or something, couldn't get away with that. And you didn't need it. And I always laughed in recent years. I'd see so many stories quoting someone close to whomever, athlete X. And I always thought to myself, you don't even know the athlete, let alone the people close to the athlete. I mean, what are you talking about? And I was kind of grandfathered into a degree because I'd been there a long time. I was 39 years around the Patriots. So I got a little more leeway than even with Belichick. I don't know, probably because it just wasn't worth it. They probably it's just not worth it. Just, I wander around and where I shouldn't be, and they just coach. And there were some older coaches would still talk to me who he would have preferred weren't talking, the younger ones, no. But it is vastly different. And I mean, in Cincinnati, I remember we had that old practice field under the bridge there, standing on the practice field talking to Sam Weiss, while practice is going on.
Yeah. Well, we had a media room. The first year I was there, they put in a media room. It was right across the very cramped quarters, right across from Jim McNally's office.
Right.
And right down the hallway from Jim Anderson's office, a running back. McNally would come in and say, "Hey, you want to see this?"
Right.
He'd come in and say, and then when Shula got the job, I kind of get everybody in trouble because I would roam. Right. And they put us out on a trailer. We couldn't go in the facility, so it was called the Hobson trailer. I remember. So it's been kind of this slow evolution of 25 years of it's with the now you've been Ron. How many years have you been on the Hall of Fame committee?
It will be 20 years next year. I was actually in funny newspaper story / football story. I was in San Francisco for a playoff game, and I was actually supposed to be waiting for Will, who was going to fly in to San Francisco because of his heart condition. They don't want him flying a lot. And the Super Bowl was, if I remember right, that year in San Diego or Pasadena. I think it was San Diego. But he was taking a nonstop into San Francisco, and then I was picking him up. We were going to drive to Southern California because he couldn't make it. The only nonstop connection he could make was there. So, for whatever reason. Well, I get a phone call from a scout friend of mine at the Senior Bowl. You can relate to all this. It's so different than how it is today. Telling me, "Hey, I think there's a problem with Will." I said, "What do you mean there's a problem with Will?" He said, "Well, his son, Terry, who was a scout and is now an executive, just told me he's got to go home. Will had a heart attack and died." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
So I said, you sure about this? Absolutely. So I reach out to Terry, who of course I don't get because he's, on his way. So I double check back, and sure enough, it's guy confirmed it. So I call my office and I call my boss, with whom I was didn't have the greatest relationship, my editor. You can relate to that, Butchie, I'm sure. And tell him, "Hey, look, here's the deal. I just got this call, and Will passed." "What are you talking about? We haven't heard anything about it." And I'll never forget, he said to me, I said, "I think we should do something." And he said, his wife would have called me. And I'm thinking to myself, if your husband just passed, somehow I don't think you're like on the top 5 people that she's going to be calling. Well, it turns out that the true story was that he had passed. He had gone and he had had a stress test that day to make sure he was cool to travel. And he passed the stress test, went home, turned on ESPN and died in his chair, had a heart attack and died in his chair. So much for stress test. But here was the kicker. So my guy refuses to let me write it. And John Dennis on Channel 7 breaks the story. So we get scooped on our own story that we had. And I remember, this is the truth, and you know Will well, so you can relate to this. I'm sitting in my room feeling pretty sad, frankly, over downtown San Francisco, overlooking the city, my favorite city in the world where I used to live. And I got the room dark, but I got the blinds open, so I'm just sort of looking outside thinking, about Will and feeling lousy. And suddenly something hit me. And I don't know if it was actually Will or just my thought of Will. I'll always believe it actually was Will. But I'm sitting in a chair and I'm looking at it, feeling sad, and all of a sudden it hit me, and I can hear Willie saying to me, "Kid," because he called everybody kid. "Kid, you just got scooped on a story that you had. The hell's wrong with you?" Because Willie, of course, was Mr. Scoop, and so then we went down. That was the Super Bowl that the Raiders got killed in, and their Barrett Robbins, the center, you remember, disappeared in the middle of the week.
Yeah.
So it came to be game day, and I had been asked to step in the day before, almost completely unprepared because I didn't know what was coming for Will.
The Hall of Fame committee, right? For the Hall.
Yeah. That year, and I didn't know at that time it was going to become permanent, although it did, and I'm very proud of that. But the day of the game, Greg Aiello came up to be the NFL head of PR and said, we'd like you to. We're going to have a moment of silence for Will in the locker room, and I mean in the press box before the game, and we'd like you to, if you could say a few words. So I said, yeah, sure. But now I'm sitting there thinking, what am I going to say about my friend Will McDonough, who was a great mentor to me, even though we had our ups and downs because we both were, hard-edged guys. So anyway, suddenly it came to me. And again, who knows, if you believe in karma and things like that I do, maybe it was Willie tapped me on the shoulder and reminded me of something. But so they gave me the microphone and I said, as you all know, we lost the greatest football writer who ever lived this week, my colleague, the great Will McDonough. And there's really nobody will ever replace him, nor is there really much I can say about Will except this. Wherever he is, he knows where Barrett Robbins is. And the whole place just exploded laughing, because everybody knew he would have known, because that was him.
It's one of the great stories from a league meeting. Will comes in from playing tennis.
Yeah.
At a league meeting, and he walks by as a bunch of writers in the lobby. As he comes back in and he points to a guy and he says, "Hey, you better call your owner. Your head coach just got fired." And here's Willie. He's been out playing tennis, but he had the scoop. He's probably playing tennis with the owner, probably.
Sure, exactly. I mean, that was him. It was amazing the people he knew, and the information that he had, and the way that he operated. Frankly, I mean, if you, no disrespect to Will, the rules were different then. If he operated the way he did then, he couldn't keep his job. Because he had alliances, he had friends, he had enemies, he had sources, he would do, he would know things that maybe he wouldn't report at a particular time, and he's trading information and all that. And, but, he had his pulse on almost everything. It got him in trouble a few times late in his career when the rules had kind of changed a bit. And, as with most of us, we tend to not change as fast as the climate does. And so it got him in a little bit of hot water a couple of times. But greatest reporter and an underrated writer, actually, but the greatest football reporter I ever saw. And then, look, there's been lots of good ones. Jerry McGee out in San Diego and Larry Felser in Buffalo and a number of others. But there was never anybody like Will. And as you pointed out earlier, in case your viewers don't know the story, he did flatten defensive back Raymond Claiborne in a locker room scrum where a group of reporters were talking to another player, and Claiborne, who could be surly, he had the next locker, and he came in, there was a little overflow, and he came in and was complaining about people being around his locker and pushed an elderly reporter guy, and Will didn't like it. And Will said something to him about, what do you think you're doing? And Claiborne said something back that was less than pleasant. And Will just hammered him in the face. Boom. Yeah. Pow. Down goes Claiborne. He went backwards and his legs hit the seat part of his locker, and he went into his locker back first, feet up in the air, and Will went in right after him. Kaboom, and nailed him again. So then Steve Grogan came running down and was friends with Will, and they sort of separated each other. But the best part of the story that few people know was the reason Will had hit him was during the interchange, Claiborne had sort of moved his hand like this. He wasn't actually trying to hit Will, but his finger hit him in the eye. And that's why Will came forward, popped him, under Will's South Boston way of operating. So now they take Will to the trainer's room to look at his eye because it was scratched. So he's sitting on the trainer's table as the trainer's looking in at his eye, and they didn't know Will was in there. So some people bring Claiborne in there, and they stop, and Willie's sitting on the table, and Willie looks at Claiborne and says, "You in here because you want a little more?" And they got Claiborne out of there in a hurry. And that was the greatest moment for sports writers and sports writing in the history of our somewhat checkered career.
Ron, go back to 75. You were covering the Raiders.
Yes, sir.
So you covered Paul Brown's last game.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it was funny. Today, there had been 2 weeks worth of lead up things about it and everything like that. But it, other than in Cincinnati, it just wasn't,
Well, Paul didn't tell anybody until.
No, right. People, but Jack, what's his last name? There was a guy who worked for the Bengals for a long time.
Jack Brennan.
No, it wasn't Jack Brennan.
Jack Clary.
Jack Clary. He knew.
Yeah.
He knew. But he didn't tell anybody.
Yeah.
So there was no fanfare. Today, you wouldn't be able to keep it hidden for 5 minutes unless he just hadn't told anybody.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, I was there at the end of what many people believe is the greatest coach to ever coach football. Certainly the most innovative, for sure. But like all of them, Butchie, as the great Bill Belichick found out this year, without the great quarterback, he didn't win either. Otto Graham retired.
Paul would probably tell you that. Paul would agree with you that. I know Mike would agree with you on that. So
it's always the same. If you don't have the trigger man, I don't care how smart you are. And Paul Brown was pretty smart. That's for sure.
But, Paul had the trigger man that day in Kenny Anderson, but he was just a couple plays short there. They couldn't block. They couldn't block Ted Hendricks, and
right.
I guess they later went back, and that was the start of pass pro, moving people out there. That was off of that game. That last series, I think Ted got the Kenny twice, I think, and they were down 31-28, I think, and if I'm not mistaken, the game ended on a sack, I think.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Ted was as you know, tremendous Hall of Fame, not only tremendous Hall of Fame linebacker, but a freak because he was 6'7" in those days where guys weren't there, 6'6", whatever he was, and he had arms, he could put his hands in his pockets or in his socks without bending over. His arm, the length of his arms. That's why he's the greatest kick blocker in the history of the sport. But yeah, Ted was a tremendous athlete, and they couldn't block him. You're right. And but Paul had all the success with Otto Graham, and you go to 10 championship games in 10 years and win 7, and then Otto retired, and that was the end of that. It's just,
how about so are Paul and Bill Belichick the 2 greatest coaches of all time?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I always hate these sort of greatest of all time things because it's how do you discount Lombardi? Who's just won all those NFL championships in a row, and has, I believe, the greatest postseason record. I think he's 9-1 in the postseason. Now people will say, well, you only have to win one, and I said, well, yeah, you only have to win one, but also everybody got eliminated at the end of the season. Only one team went forward. There was no chance to save yourself, and go 11-5 and get in the playoffs, and it's a new season. No, there was no new season.
Right.
So Lombardi would have to be in there. I personally think maybe and look, Belichick's record is stupendous, obviously, although we'll see how stupendous it is if he doesn't find a quarterback. It's a lot less stupendous pretty quickly. But in a lot of ways, I think you can make a strong case for Joe Gibbs. Joe Gibbs won 3 Super Bowls with 3 different quarterbacks, none of whom were Hall of Fame caliber quarterbacks, none of them. And most of these other guys won when they had a Hall of Fame quarterback, won it all at least, and didn't when they didn't. I mean, Bill Belichick, for example, he's now coached, I believe it's now 9 seasons without Tom Brady. And in those 9 seasons, his win-loss percentage is lower than Rex Ryan's.
There you go.
So, Rex Ryan always used to say, if I had Brady and they had my guys, I'd have won all those Super Bowls. Well, I'm not so sure about that, but he would have won a couple. Sure. And if he was smart enough to get out of Brady's way, like Bruce Arians did this year, he probably would have won all. So that's not to say Belichick isn't a great coach, but I used to say this about Shula at the end of his career when he was taking a lot of heat down in Miami. That, and Belichick eventually will hear it at the end because all the great coaches do. Paul Brown, everybody. Oh, they lost it. The game has passed them by. That's what and I always used to think to myself, what do you think? The guy suddenly forgot how to coach offense and defense? He suddenly forgot how to call a play? That isn't what it is. His players aren't as good. And I think with all coaches, I used to say this to Parcells, who, over the years became a friend of mine. I used to say to Parcells, coaches plan and players play. You plan all you want, but if I tell Burfict not to go in there and decapitate some guy after the whistle, and then he does it at the worst of times, what do you think? I didn't tell him not to do that? But people say you can't control the guy. Well, I guess maybe I couldn't to some extent, but I certainly didn't tell him to go. Or like the Kansas City, you have two guys in the Super Bowl this year. You have two guys line up in the neutral zone on a punt.
Yeah.
Nobody told him to do that. I can quite assure you. But what do they say? Well, the coach is, he doesn't. It's his fault somehow.
Yeah. Let's get right to it, Ron. You're on the senior committee at the Hall of Fame, where Bengals fans are clamoring for Ken Riley and
Ken Riley. They're clamoring for every guy who's ever worn a uniform. It's unbelievable. The assault on my email box and my social media boxes has been incredible.
But Ron, tell the people how hard it is to be a senior nominee. I think now, as I've tried to tell them, there are nine members of it's basically the senior committee is a subcommittee of the Hall of Fame voting board of selectors. You're one of the 9, but that rotates every year too. So there's 5 guys that basically decide who the senior nominee is going to be, and tell them what that process is like.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think the thing that makes it most clear is there's 58 first ballot all-decade players in the senior pool, most of whom have never even been discussed by the full committee. So you're talking about players who were viewed as one of the 11 best players on offense or defense of their decade, Drew Pearson being the latest example. And they haven't even been able to be debated in many cases. And in some cases they have been, but they didn't get in for whatever reason. So yeah, I'm the guy who dubbed it the Great Abyss, the senior pool. You get into the senior pool, you're in the Great Abyss. You have crossed the river Styx. You are in damnation, for you Dante readers. And that's just a sad circumstance. I mean, and the problem is there's such a backup. I mean, this year, for example, Clay Matthews, you're eligible for 20 years, as you know, in the regular running. And Clay Matthews, in his 20th year, finally got into the room for the first time.
And being in the room means he's one of the 15 finalists, or he's a senior finalist.
Right.
He's discussed, and he's discussed in front of the entire committee. Correct.
Which is a committee of 48 people, of which the great Butch Hobson is one. And that's a good thing. But this was Clay's last year of eligibility under the regular 20-year window. First time he'd ever been in there. And he didn't make it. So now he's tumbled into the senior pool. Well, there's some people yelling, you got to bring him out. He should have been discussed more than one time, and blah, 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 blah. Well, here's the problem. How do you turn around and bring out a guy who just tumbled into the Great Abyss when you've got guys that have been in the Great Abyss for 30, 40 years? I mean, the poster boy for all this, there's 2 of them. The classic is Jerry Kramer. Jerry Kramer, the great Green Bay offensive lineman, was picked as the only guard on the NFL's 50th anniversary team, on the 50th year of the league's existence, which would have been 1975. Jerry was picked as the only guard on that team. He didn't get in until 2 years ago. He was 80-something years old by the time he got in. Now, I always used to say, how is that possible? How did he end up in solitary confinement for, he'd come up a number of times and not made it, shockingly to me, including one time when I presented him. And what happens, as you know, you take Clay Matthews, probably half the committee is young enough, they never saw Clay Matthews play a snap. Mm. And many times, and I was a bit like this when I was a younger voter, over time you learn how little you actually know. But I would say, well, if the guys who actually watched him play and knew him better than me didn't put him in, who am I to be putting him in? They've made a 20-year declaration that he's not a Hall of Fame. In theory, well, now I realize there's so many other factors that can, including the latest, which we'll probably get into, proliferation of first ballot Hall of Famers, which has gone off the rails. Because every time you do that, some guy who doesn't get in, he's been in there 4 or 5 times. Now it's a 6th time or an 8th time or a 10th time. Well, by the time you get to the 10th time that you're a finalist and you don't get in, now you get some new voters coming in saying, well, you didn't put him in for 10 years. Now all of a sudden he's a Hall of Famer. Isn't he? Maybe he's the Hall of Very Good. So that's the long-winded version of the situation. But if you're in a senior pool, Isaac Curtis, Ken Anderson, Lamar Parrish, Kenny Riley. I mean, how can a guy like Kenny Riley have 65 interceptions, which I believe is 2nd or 3rd all time? How can that?
Fifth all time. The thing is, Charles Woodson just went in first ballot. He's got 65.
Right. I mean, how is that possible? Well, I hear people say, well, he didn't go to the Pro Bowl, and Lamar Parrish did, who was the other corner. And I always say to the younger voters, Lamar Parrish went because he was also a kick returner, and they took one kick returner, and he was one of the best kick returners. He wasn't going there because he was better than Ken Riley, in my opinion, anyway. And then some people say, well, I had a guy say this to me one time. Well, they had all those picks because they wouldn't throw at Lamar Parrish. And I said, well, you know what? Then there were a lot of stupid quarterbacks, because if a guy picks off 65 balls and you keep throwing in his direction, you're an idiot. Right. What are you talking about? But when you're a senior guy, like Kenny Riley, that begins to become these kinds of arguments or discussions that are almost absurd on the face of it.
Right. I mean, you've been a guy. I mean, you've been a longtime supporter of both these guys.
For sure.
Kenny's. Yeah. I mean, you've been telling me for 10 years they're gonna get in. It's a matter of when.
Right. Kenny, I think for sure will get in. I shouldn't say for sure, because when you're in the senior pool, there is no for sure, but I would hope so. Some of us on the committee feel very strongly that we need to bring a Bengal player out of there, which has not happened. They've never had a senior guy.
Right. The Bengals have only one true Hall of Famer who played for him his entire career, Anthony Munoz. Only one. Right. And that's not. And the senior committee was designed to right wrongs.
Sure.
And
exactly.
That's a huge wrong. It's another huge wrong that Ken Riley never made a Pro Bowl. That's not. I mean, we all know the Pro Bowl selection process is flawed at best. So that's another chance to right a wrong. And I tip my hat to the all-decade teams. Obviously, the guys put a lot of research in there. There have been mistakes made there too. So on 3 fronts, from a team standpoint, from an individual standpoint, the senior committee can, thank God, is there to right wrongs.
Right. But it's still very frustrating because, as you point out, there's 9 of us, but it's 5. It's sort of a rotating 5 that nominate and vote each August. We usually have a list of 15 or 20 players who we debate, and then we come out with a guy. But it's as happy as we may feel for the guy we bring out, we feel worse for the guys we didn't bring out. And I'll give you 2 examples. One year there was a player, I won't give his name because he's still alive, and who knows, maybe he can still get a shot. But there was a tie vote. And I never was quite totally sure how. Someone had to be abstaining for a while between 2 guys. And we voted literally 3 or 4 times. And it kept coming up, tie vote, we got to vote again. And finally, somebody either the abstaining person finally voted, or somebody changed horses and one player went forward and got into the Hall of Fame, and the other guy, despite 3 or 4 votes, didn't, and has never been nominated again.
Mm.
So that's how close it can be. The other guy who I think is a great example of how this happens is Bob Kuchenberg, who was the best offensive lineman on those great Dolphin teams of the 70s and early 80s. Everybody knows that. As good as Larry Little was, and as good as Stevenson was, Dwight Stevenson, the great center, who was one of the greatest centers, and it really kind of changed the position because he was so athletic. They all deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, but Kuchenberg was the best of them. I mean, he made All-Pro at guard, he made All-Pro at tackle, wherever they needed him to go. Played forever, which was part of his problem. All those other guys retired and got in the Hall of Fame while he was still playing. By the time he retired, and then 5 years later becomes eligible, I think there was almost a sort of sense of like, how many of these Dolphin offensive linemen are we going to put in here, you know? And so he came up year after year after year, never got in. And it's really kind of sad. He finally passed away, I believe, if I remember right. And without ever getting in, became pretty bitter about it. And I remember Ed Pope, who was also passed away, the great writer from Miami, was on the Hall committee for forever. Was so upset about Kuchenberg not getting in. And we were talking one time, and I said, well, you know, Ed, you were part of the problem. Even though you're my dear friend, you were part of the problem. What? You know how he would talk that crackly voice. What? I said, you went in there and told us Larry Little was the best Dolphin lineman. And then you came in and you told us Dwight Stevenson was the best. And then you came in and told us Kuchenberg was. Everybody can't be the best. You know, don't say that if you don't mean it. The guy.
Yeah. Let's talk about Kenny Anderson. 10 quarters since he was eligible in 1992 for the first running. 10 quarterbacks have gone in, and I think probably all of them deserve to be in. I know you, Ken. You covered Ken Stabler. Ken Stabler deserves. There's no question in my mind. Ken Stabler deserves to be in.
Sure. But, long time before he got in, by the way.
That's right. And I think Kenny's just went back. I mean, and you know the numbers on Anderson. 3 guys since the merger have won at least four NFL passing titles.
Right.
Staubach and Steve Young and Kenny. You know, pretty good. That's a bellwether stat for him. But it's amazing, I think, and you've heard me say this all the time. There are too many good players on great teams in there, as we just noted, all those Dolphins offensive linemen. There's not enough guys like the 2 Kennys, great players on teams that never won it.
Right.
You know, and you know, there's no question that the 10 quarterbacks that went in, they had the numbers, they had the rings, but there's got to be a spot for a guy who was one of the, you know, probably the first great modern efficient passer. You know, the first guy to hit 70% in the season, and I think his passer rating for a guy whose career started since 1971 is, you know, the 6th best, and by the time he retired, and you know, all the 5 guys ahead of him are in. But I can see how a guy like that gets passed over because he was not a flashy guy. He won 1 MVP, but he didn't win a Super Bowl, and I think that's wrong. But I can see how it happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think the several things work against him. The biggest one being, like you say, you know, he was the quarterback who got 2 teams a Super Bowl, but he couldn't find a way to win the game. You know, and had he won a Super Bowl, probably already be in, which is completely unfair. Secondly, I think I know some of the older voters, a lot of whom are gone now, and this is one of the things that happens. A lot of the older voters were convinced that he was a system quarterback. You know, he was a product of this system, and not really, you know, at least in their mind, you know, what they see as a great quarterback. And now you've got the flip side for poor Kenny, where you've got half the committee never heard of Kenny Anderson. And the fact that he played in Cincinnati didn't help him either. You know, he did the same thing.
He never heard of Willie Anderson.
Right. But if he had done the same stuff in New York or Los Angeles, Chicago, he'd probably been in a long time ago. And that's just kind of unfortunate, frankly.
Will Pearson Drew Pearson ought to go in, and this is kind of an example of that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Pearson had because you'd have to say I never saw Curtis or Pearson play in person,
Right.
but Isaac has some numbers that are pretty significantly better. But Pearson, very solid and had a great postseason career. He definitely ought to go in. Played 22 postseason games and had 8 touchdowns and averaged 16 yards per catch. Big time numbers back then in playoff games.
Sure, and he was a first team all decade receiver. I mean.
Whereas Isaac didn't have, but Isaac wasn't exposed to on the big. He made it to he played in 6 playoff games.
Right.
Which in a team game, it's too bad because that hurts guys.
Well, sure it does. And as you know, a lot of guys kid me that I'm the patron saint of lost causes because I've been successful getting a number of guys. Andre Tippett being one, Les Richter, the great linebacker from back in the day with the old LA Rams. Stabler, Ray Guy, both of them were in the senior pool, and I was able to get them out and help get them in. I think that they need a sponsor, which you certainly have been for these guys, an advocate. Unfortunately, if you're in a position like you're in, for example, you can't advocate for everybody because then nobody gets in.
Well, that's
So at some point,
some people have said Anderson and Riley will they counter each other, which they both deserve to be in, but the fact that there are 2 probably doesn't help. But I also
not once they're in the senior pool. You're right. I mean, because you're not going to bring out back-to-back guys from any team. There's just too many guys in there that need to be vetted. So at some point you have to kind of go all in on one guy or the other. I mean, the quarterbacks generally, because they have more discernible stats. A guy like Willie Anderson has no real stats. I mean, there's some stats, but they're more difficult to come up with. I mean, I'll give you an example. One of the things that was keeping Ray Guy out, I was told, who in my mind was the greatest punter of all time and was a weapon, was his net. His net was not particularly great. I forget what it was off the top of my head, and certainly doesn't rank up with people today. So I knew that was a problem. And again, I'm not blowing my horn, but this is sort of how deep into the weeds you have to go trying to get some guy out of the senior pool. I watched, with the help of the Raiders, every punt Ray Guy ever made, charted them all, 1,047 punts. And let me tell you, brother, that's a lot of punts. These guys in shoe stores haven't seen that many feet. And wasn't sure what I was going to find, but I covered it for him for a number of years, so I thought I knew what I was going to find. And it turned out to be correct, but it was a long shot. And what I found was, yes, his net wasn't what you might expect from the greatest punter of all time. But the reason was there were times where the Raiders had him punting from the other team's 35-yard line because he could put it out of bounds on the 2-yard line, the 3-yard line. He punted 7 times in the Redskins Super Bowl. I remember Russ Grimm told me, the guy who beat us was Ray Guy. That's how we lost that Super Bowl. He punted 7 times in that Super Bowl. 5 of the 7 were on the other team's 50 side of the 50-yard line. And 1 was from 37 yards, which he put out at the 4-yard line. So that means the Redskins are starting from the 4-yard line. What it also means is his net is 33 yards. So you look at his, if you just look at his net, you say, geez, what he punt left-footed?
Yeah.
Now, not every presenter, frankly, wants to look at 1,047 punts and find out how many of them. I believe in the end, if I remember right, that somewhere approaching 25% of his career punts were launched from the inside the other team's beyond the 50-yard line. In other words, from the 49-yard line in. Well, obviously that's going to affect your net.
Yeah.
Why'd they do that? 2 reasons. For a number of years they didn't trust their field goal kicker, so they would punt, against the Steelers from the 40-yard line or the 35-yard line because they didn't trust that the kicker would make the kick.
Right.
And so should you be penalized for that because you were doing what your team? No, but you also have to educate the other voters, because I get it. Everybody doesn't have time to or inclination to dive in the weeds. Another guy was Floyd Little. One of the things that supposedly hurt Floyd Little for years was that his career rushing average was 3.9 yards a carry. And when we finally, a number of us from the senior committee were finally able to put together a case that got him in, two of the things we mentioned, Jeff Legwald did a great job, and I helped him as best I could. And Legwald made clear that if he took all his career carries, it was a difference of about 6 inches a carry that would have made him 4.0 or 4, whatever some of these guys thought was acceptable. And then I pointed out that he played most of his career in an era where they had those wide hash marks. So when they would put the ball in the hash mark, everybody in the place knew you weren't running to your left, because 3 or 4 steps, you were out of bounds. So when they moved the hash marks in closer to the middle of the field, late in his career, he immediately rushed for over 1,000 yards his first season, and nearly 1,000 the second season when he missed a game due to injury, which seldom happened. So, and in those years, he was averaging well over 4 yards a carry. And I pointed out that the year before they moved the hash marks, there was only, I believe, one guy, it might have been 2, but I think it was one guy had rushed for over 1,000 yards. As soon as they moved him in, 9 guys did it. So you couldn't judge Floyd Little's 3.9 yard per carry average against Terrell Davis, because it was, there's 2 different fields they were playing on. And as soon as they changed the field for Little, even though he was an older player, he got in. It's a great story about him. He was very good friends with Jim Brown, because he came right after Jim Brown at Syracuse. And number 44 was the number for the great Syracuse running backs in those days. And Jimmy Brown had it, who in my opinion is the greatest football player ever lived, and certainly the greatest runner who ever lived. And they gave Floyd Little was the next. And Jim Brown was very supportive of him. So over the years, they became quite friendly. Floyd told a story after he got elected, how Jim had come to him several times in that sort of Jim Brown way, and said, what do you care what these people think? Whether they put you in the Hall of Fame or not. You're a Hall of Famer. And Floyd said, I looked at Jim and I said, yeah, easy for you to say, you're in the Hall of Fame. And it was a good point, Yeah, you can say all you want. I know what I was, which we hear from players. But they all would like the rest of the world to know what they were too. And I'm sure even a guy as quiet and unassuming as Ken Anderson underneath it all probably feels that way. I'm sure he looks in that room and says, I was as good as that guy. I was as good as that guy, or I was as good as that guy. But he, if he was more of a chest thumper, maybe it would have helped if he had one more. I mean, I don't know quite. I think one of the things early on that hurt him too, although I wasn't on the committee at the time, was I think a lot of people looked and said, well, if Greg Cook hadn't got hurt, then you never would have heard of Ken Anderson, which is true, probably. Yeah. But that isn't what happened.
No.
He went out and led the league in passing 4 times. So, Greg Cook was tremendous. I know you probably never saw him because you're a young buck, but I mean, that guy had a rocket. That guy was like Burt Jones. Burt Jones isn't in the Hall of Fame either.
Right. But we all know Jim Brown and Floyd Little. But we all know that Syracuse's all-time leading rusher is Joe Morris out of Ayer, Massachusetts.
There you go, out of Ayer, Massachusetts. Exactly.
Now you kind of answered the question, Ron, and I'll wrap it up with this. I really can't thank you enough for spending the time.
It's been great.
But just one last question. You said Jim Brown you think is the greatest player who ever lived. Who's the greatest player you think that you saw when you covered? I don't think you covered.
I didn't cover him. I saw him obviously as a young guy, you know. And
but how about when you were, in your 40 years of covering?
Right. In terms of running backs, I always thought it was Eric Dickerson.
How about any player, any position?
Well, I'm biased because I very much liked the guy when I was a young player coming up, tried to model myself after him, which was a joke because it was Dick Butkus. I mean, no one's played football like Dick Butkus. I mean, I always used to say, if there was ever a guy who had the right name for football, it was Dick Butkus. You know what I mean? You just heard that name and you knew, like, wow, that was assault and battery. Yeah. The greatest defensive back I ever actually saw, in my opinion, was Michael Haynes. you can talk
Former
about,
Raider and Patriot.
right. You can talk about Deion Sanders all you want, and Deion was great. But I always used to kid and still do kid Michael that the only thing that Sanders did that Michael couldn't do was beat his chest. I mean, he was a tremendous return man until they, told him to stop doing it. He was as smooth cover guy as you could ever see, an athlete, and he would tackle you and put you on the ground, which Deion would not do. So quarterback always becomes the big thing. Well, who's the greatest quarterback? I would say Unitas in terms of who I saw, who I covered. It becomes a little bit difficult because I saw so many great quarterbacks. I mean, I saw Stabler when he was great. I saw Tom Brady's nearly every game that he ever played in person. But as a pure quarterback, I don't think anybody's ever better than John Elway ever.
Yeah.
Marino was a better pure thrower, but he couldn't move. Other guys, Michael Vick was a better mover, but he couldn't throw like John Elway. John Elway, I mean, that guy, he took 5 teams, Butchie, to the Super Bowls that never should have been in the playoffs.
Yeah.
Now, he lost those games, but I always said, do you understand what he did? I mean, I was at that Cleveland game when he led the drive.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable because about halfway through it, you knew they're not going to stop him.
Yeah.
He made athletic plays. He threw balls with flames coming out of the back. I mean, that was a great player. But, it's always hard, and because we've talked about this with from time to time, it's always hard to say this guy's the greatest or that guy's the greatest. Yeah. I mean, you could make an argument that Bo Jackson was the greatest running back ever. He just didn't play long enough.
Right.
Who the hell tackled him? And I was at the game where he got the injury that ended his career, and it didn't even look like any big deal against your Cincinnati Bengals.
Right. I think that's why we haven't won a playoff game since. It's the curse of Bo.
That was bad, and it wasn't a dirty play or anything. It just was unfortunate.
Kevin Walker made that tackle.
Yeah, and he just started tackling and pulling him down in a way, and he popped his hip, but it didn't really look like anything. Sometimes you see those hits and you go, "Oh my God," but it wasn't like that. And Bo stood on the sidelines the rest of the game. In fact, late in the game was playing. I remember him tossing a football behind the bench to his son.
Right. So, he came out and walked out. He saw some of the Bengals came over after the game before they got on the bus. They went over and he walked out.
Right. You didn't look at it and say, "Boy, you'll never recover from that," but he did.
It's a deep bench. I think they turned to Marcus Allen. I think who ended up getting 140. I think that's a fairly deep bench.
Oh yeah. Wouldn't you say? You say so. Yeah.
But hey, Ron, it's
before we go, who's the greatest football player you ever saw?
I have to say, who I saw in a game.
Yeah.
And actually covered. I would have to say probably. I think I might have to agree with you when it comes to Elway, but I also think a guy who was just unbelievable. Randy Moss, I thought was unbelievable. Yeah. I just thought, I'd probably have to give it a close. I think I'd give it to Moss. Guy was just broke open games.
Right.
Right. Just. The one year he was with Brady, they were unbelievable.
Right.
He could just. He was. But Elway, I'll tell you, because I saw him. I think he was. I don't think the Bengals ever beat him. He was 7-0 against them.
Right.
Some bad clubs, and you couldn't defend him because he'd if there was nobody open, he'd run. I mean, he was a hell of a runner. I mean, I actually covered him for I actually covered a couple of games when he was the right fielder for the Oneonta Yankees.
Oh wow!
In '82. And he had a nice sweet swing. I remember going leaving a Super Bowl party that he was at, I guess, and I was like kind of had to walk past them, and I said 317 at Oneonta. I think that's what he hit, 317, and he goes 318, but good call. He's but a nice sweet swinging lefty, and but I mean, whenever the Bengals had lost some heartbreakers to him, but he always had the ability to make that one squeeze out either a scramble or a ridiculous throw,
Right.
So
I saw him make
that's a good call, Ron.
Well, I saw him make Butchie a throw that people who saw it, he was a sophomore at Stanford, people who saw it all say it's the greatest pass ever thrown. It was against USC when USC was really something. And he was rolling to his right at Stanford Stadium with about 1,000 pounds of USC defenders bearing down on him as he was approaching the sidelines. And it was clear that he was going to die a violent death if this ball didn't go somewhere. And I'm telling you, he's rolling right at full speed, pursued by all these guys, and wham, lets this bullet go all the way across the field for a 40-yard gain on a line. On a line. It was unbelievable. The USC guys pursuing him all stopped. And Johnny Robinson was USC's coach at the time. And he told me after the game, he said, I stood there on the sidelines and said to myself, I just saw the greatest pass ever thrown. It was completed to a tight end from whose name I forget. But it was like, how do you do that?
Yeah. Of course, Mahomes is doing that every day now.
Yeah, Mahomes is terrific. God, he, for all the trouble he had in that game, he nearly committed. He nearly completed two of the greatest passes ever, which he hit the guy in the face both times. That one where he was parallel to the ground. Who gave him that arm?
Clearly, they had that in mind when they decided not to help the left tackle. I guess they figured Patrick will find a way. I guess.
That was unbelievable. That there was a good example of what I've said so much about. Parcells told me one time, coaches lose more games than they win.
Right.
And I would argue they helped lose that game by not helping that guy, which, as it always happens, Butchie, I know we got to go, but it always leads me to a story, because when you're around 1,000 years, you got stories.
Whenever you get two old sports writers together, stories never end.
We got no money, but we got stories.
Yeah.
And, the Patriots are playing in the Super Bowl in 1996 against the great Green Bay Packers. And they have a left tackle named Max Lane. And the offensive coordinator is a guy named Ray Perkins, passed not too long ago.
Right.
My friend Drew Bledsoe was the quarterback. Drew told me the story later. So as they're preparing for the game and the game plan, they're not giving Max any help on Reggie White, which Drew, as the quarterback, brought to Ray's attention a number of times. Really, you think this is... And he says to him, I know something, and he's great Southern Alabama drawl, Ray Perkins. I know something about Reggie White that not many people know. So Drew goes, okay, what's that? Reggie don't like to play on turf. So Drew looks at him and says, in the Super Bowl? he just don't like to play on turf. He don't go all out on turf. Okay. And if you remember, late in the game, they're driving to tie the game, and had really put up quite a fight against a team that was far better than they were, the Patriots. Drew goes back to pass, and Reggie White ragdolls Max twice, including backing him up and throwing him into Bledsoe, and then falling on the two of them on third down. And Drew, and this is a thing that wouldn't happen today. People wouldn't tell you this story today, but it was different then. Drew comes to the sides. He's steaming. He comes to the sidelines, walks up to Perkins, and he goes, I guess he doesn't mind playing on turf today. And, and they punted, and then what's his name ran the thing back for a touchdown. That was it. That was it.
Yeah.
But it just, but you're right. Mahomes, if he keeps going the way he's going, I think people are way too quick to say this guy, that guy's the greatest, whatever. Gronk's his tight end. This guy's no, he's not. He's really good. He's probably going to go to the Hall of Fame, but take it easy. And now Mahomes is the same thing. He's the greatest quarterback. Well, wait a minute. He just got beat by a guy who's won 7 Super Bowls.
Yeah.
Like I got a little beef with somebody yesterday, was talking about, Brady's getting all this credit for that. It was the defense that won that game. I said, well, I said, look, the defense was terrific in that game.
Yeah.
But somebody threw 3 touchdown passes for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Was it one of their defensive players? He didn't throw 1; he threw 3, and he gave them that massive lead with that. So, where do you put Brady? because he's hard to quantify.
Yeah, he's well, he's not that hard to quantify. I mean, I gotta.
No, but I mean, when you look at the great throwers, he's not one of the great throwers.
But he's got, and I hate that, but he's got 7 of those damn things.
Right.
He should
Well,
have
if they had held against the Giants and
right, he should have 9.
Seymour had sacked him.
Yeah. But you can also say, well, maybe you only would have had 5 if.
Well, sure, that right, because there were some that were pretty close.
But he's got 7, and I guess the reason I say Moss, I guess, and Elway, is because they were so flashy.
Right.
Brady's just not. Brady just kind of goes out there and he just does what you expect him to do. I mean.
Well, like in the championship game against the Packers, I thought that the best throw he made in the whole game was an incomplete pass on 2nd down late in the game when they were moving, and they needed another field goal to put themselves, in a situation that probably Green Bay couldn't overcome. And the one thing he couldn't do was get sacked. And the snap came, and he realized instantaneously, I'm going to get sacked.
Yeah.
He rifled that thing in the ground in the direction of a running back.
Yeah.
Nobody noticed that pass, but that won him the game.
Yeah.
Because he hit a short pass the next one. They made a field goal, and they went up by 2 scores, and that was it. Normally, that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for Elway throwing that rope, like I was saying, or Randy Moss. What he always used to say, when I'm covered, I'm open. Then he'd leap over 3 guys or something, catch. So that's why he's hard to quantify. I mean, it'd be interesting if Paul Brown was still here to ask him autogram.
Mike Brown saw autogram. I wrote a story on that, and he said it's just tough to compare. He said, "I'm not, he said it's tough to compare the eras."
Oh, sure.
I'm biased because he was an Otto guy. He saw every home game that Otto ever played.
Right.
And he said if there's one thing that Otto had, Otto was more athletic. I mean, Otto played. He was a backup guard for the Rochester Royals in the NBA.
Right.
Ring there too, and but he said he had the same stuff that Brady had. Smart, had a better, didn't have a great arm, but had a good enough arm, just like Brady. And he said, but it's tough because, I mean, it's a different, it's a different game. I mean,
sure it is, right? I mean, I always used to kid Brady, as he was closing in the recent years, and everybody was saying he's the greatest, or the winningest. That was always the big thing. He's the wins. And I was just telling him, no, you're not. And he's no historian of the game. And I said, ever heard of Otto Graham? And he had, but he didn't really know. I said, he went to 10 straight championship games and won 7. And in his spare time, won an NBA championship. So when you start playing and beating LeBron, then we can talk. And he would laugh, really? And I said, yeah, he did.
That's why I always tell these guys, I was getting arguments with our players about, the greatest basketball player. And they never heard of Bill Russell.
I know.
But I said, not only did he win 11, but he was a player coach for the last 2.
Right.
So when Michael comes back and plays and wins 2 coaching, then I'll think of it.
Well, here's what you're right. And obviously being Boston guys, we're biased, but here's what I always say about Bill Russell, because that argument came up this year after Brady won again. Is he the greatest winner of all? Right. And somebody said something about Russell's 11 championships. And I said, hold on. It's a lot more than that. And it was my friend said, we talked. I said, he won 11 NBA championships. He won the Olympic gold medal. He won 2 NCAA championship teams at the University of San Francisco on undefeated teams. Mm-hmm. And he won 2 straight California state championships with McClymonds High School. Yeah. So that guy was a champion from age 16 till the day he walked away. Yeah. You're talking about that's 2, and 2 is 4, and 1 is 5, and 11 is 16. Yeah. So he probably won 16 championships in 20 years of competitive basketball. Right from
well, probably less than that, because 69 we're talking was that last championship.
Right. Yeah, it was probably even less. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So everywhere you went, the team won.
Yep. Drake Patrick to this day still calls me Bill. Good
Well,
one to end it on. The great
It's
Bill
true.
Russell.
Yeah.
I guess I should, and I didn't get the name Joey Gamache in there, but Joey Gamache was a fighter we both covered from
Yes, sir.
So
Where were you in those? You were what? You were in Portland then.
I
Right?
was at the Portland Press Herald. And,
You were the hometown paper of the great Joey Gamache.
spent a nice time in their kitchen talking to him and his dad. Nice people.
And let me tell you, Joey became a really good professional trainer after he stopped. I mean, he still is. He's a good trainer.
Knew the game. Just like you know the game.